Welcome to Talent Matters, the podcast where talent, skills, and grit take centre stage. I'm your host, Donal O'Donoghue, and this is episode 8. Now, I have to say the podcast is brought to you with thanks to our sponsors, Sanderson, a leader in global talent solutions, and Finero, the multi-award winning tax experts who support financial success for contractors, freelancers, and solopreneurs. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by broadcaster, journalist and author Matt Cooper. Matt, you're very welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How are you, Matt?
I think I'm all right because I don't normally do interviews like this. I prefer doing the interviews, and even recently I would have done a round of interviews for my latest book, Who Really Owns Ireland, but it would have been on the basis of talking about the content of the book rather than talking about myself. So I don't know how this is going to go.
I've been looking forward to getting you on the other side of the microphone for a while now. Because
indeed, you've been on the last word many times, yes.
You've an interesting story, and that's what we'd love to delve into, because as I said to you, the podcast is all about talent, which emerges early in life, and then the skills you acquire, and then the grit and determination to kind of get on with things and to build a career. So would you start us off and tell us a little bit about your early life?
Oh, well, I grew up in Cork, was born in Cork in 1966, would have gone to school in St. Joseph's for primary school in the Mardyke, went to the North Mon for my secondary school, went from there on to UCC, where I did a commerce degree between 1983 and 1987, which I didn't particularly like at the time, but would actually turned out to be exceptionally useful to me as I went on. And I left Cork in 87 temporarily, I thought, when I went to Dublin City University, but it was actually NIHE at the time in Glasnevin. I got on the postgraduate diploma in journalism course, and I've actually been in Dublin ever since, because that's where work has kept me ever since.
And what sparked the interest in journalism?
I always wanted to be a journalist for whatever reason. Since going back to being a child, I used to read the newspapers voraciously. We would have got in the house the Examiner in the morning, Cork Examiner as it was then, the Evening Echo in the evening. We would have had Sunday newspapers such as the Sunday Independent. When the Sunday Tribune launched, that would have been a regular in our house from the very, very start. Back in the early 1980s, and I was always very interested in that. So did later become editor of the paper was a particular life career thrill.
And the youngest editor in the country at the time,
yeah,
were
I
you,
think I was the youngest apparently of any national newspaper. I was just turned 30, which was I was probably young and innocent and naive enough to believe I could make a difference at the time. So when I was growing up, I was really into newspapers. The radio would have always been a major part in listening to what was going on, and television. So I remember a lot of the big events, news, current affairs, but through the 1980s in particular. And I was always interested in it. And I remember when I was doing my Leaving Cert in my final year, I was 16 when I did my Leaving Cert. This was before you had transition year and whatever. And a career guidance teacher asked me, what did I want to do? And I said I wanted to go into newspapers, journalism. And he said, do you have any relatives into paper? And I went, no, I don't. I'd forget about that, so you've no chance. If you don't know anyone in there, don't have any relatives, you'll never get in. Think you're doing something else. And I sort of was very taken aback by that, and then went to college. There weren't many in my class who went to college. I think there was 5 of us went to UCC, maybe about another dozen or so went to what was then the Regional Technical College in Cork. It was a time of high unemployment in Cork, and people didn't see many opportunities. And even though, as I said, I didn't like my commerce degree, it actually ended up being very useful to me, because I started getting the itch again in college. This is what I really want to do. I don't want to go into accountancy. I don't want to go into business. And I started deciding, well, if I can get into journalism, I'll try and do business journalism in a way that's more accessible, because I was even finding, as somebody who was going through my commerce degree, I could find the business pages of the newspapers somewhat inaccessible at the time. And I thought to myself, well, if I can get into that. But I didn't really want to do that. So when I got on the journalism course in DCU, it was actually sports what I wanted to do. I was really, really into doing sports. But the opportunity arose while I was in there to go on a placement to Business and Finance magazine. And I got that. And from there, I went to the I was asked to join the launch team at the Business Post back in late 1989, and my career has been in newspapers ever since. And even though I've been broadcasting for the last 21 years full time, I've never left newspapers. I've always continued writing for at least one newspaper as well as doing the broadcasting.
And tell us a little bit about the decision to transition to broadcasting.
Yeah, that was probably one of the big gambles that I took, because I absolutely loved newspapers and still do love newspapers, even as newspapers transition into the digital area. I suppose I love news, and I love finding stories and breaking stories and discussing stories and analysing them. And I loved my time in the Tribune, and I had great people working there with me, and I had nearly 6.5 very happy years as editor. And then the opportunity came up. Eamon Dunphy was leaving The Last Word as presenter, and I had been acting as stand-in every now and again, doing days here and there, occasionally a week here or there, on top of doing the editorship of the Tribune. And I suppose there were some issues in relation with the ownership of the Tribune as to its ambitions for the paper, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of investment, particularly in printing, to give us the quality printed product that would have matched the content that we were putting into it. I mean, it was a big frustration in that we weren't able to get the colour advertising because of the poor reproduction on the printing presses. And I felt that we were being handicapped unnecessarily in relation to that. So a certain degree of tension had developed between myself and Independent News and Media, who were the funders and essentially the owners of the Tribune. And as that tension developed, it just so happened that Willie O'Reilly, who was the chief executive of Today FM, came to me and asked me, would I be interested in taking over if Dunphy left, because Dunphy at that stage was talking about going. And when Eamon did confirm that he was going, then there was a bit of speculation as to who was he going to get. But actually, I knew that I had the job lined up, and we were just literally doing the negotiations as to terms and conditions. And then I had to extricate myself from the Tribune, which in some respects was difficult, because I had persuaded a lot of people to go and work in the newspaper. A lot of very good people had moved from other newspapers, from other places. And I mean, I would genuinely think I'd assembled a really good team of people there. People, many of whom still work in journalism, excellent journalists in many places, really committed journalists. There weren't people who were going off to become government advisors necessarily, whatever. They really loved what they were doing in journalism. So explaining to them that, well, actually, thanks for joining me here, but I'm off, was a little bit difficult. But I took a decision at that stage. I was 36. I had 2 young children, a third one on the way, but that I would try it, that I was still young enough that if it didn't work out, I'd be able to get back in somewhere else in newspapers, maybe not as an editor again, or maybe not immediately as an editor, but I decided it was worth the choice. And over 21 years later, I'm still presenting The Last Word on Today FM.
Which is a brilliant show, I have to say. I know I'm completely biased, but it is. Tell us a little bit about the skills you had to develop, because there's a certain amount of the journalistic background that translates across, but there's other skills to develop. And I remember one of the early times that I was a contributor on the show with you, I remember we had looked at a few articles that we might talk about, and that, or I think after the show had started, somebody threw a milkshake or something on Leo Varadkar, and the producer ran in, put a line through what we were about to talk about and handed us, and I looked up at the clock and it was like 7 seconds before we were back on air. And I remember personally thinking, this is a moment of growth, being under that pressure, So I'd love to hear from your side, what were the skills you had to acquire and how did you make that adjustment?
I love moments like that. I love when there's breaking news. To be honest, like even last week, when Leo Varadkar announced Wednesday morning that he was stepping down, like I was delighted, because that meant there was such a buzz about the programme that we would be able to produce for that day. I was just so looking forward to getting in behind the microphone and getting stuck into it. Although I first actually wrote, I was quite happy with myself, and I say that I still have the fast writing skills, because we had my 900-word analysis of why Varadkar was going up on the Business Post website by 1:45. Like I started writing it at about 11:45, listened to his speech, finished off the piece, and we got it up, which is one of the
Brilliant.
skills of being a newspaper. I think you have to be able at times to do things very, very quickly off the cuff. So yeah, there's different skills. I mean, I would have trained. Well, go back to UCC, and one of the most important people to me there was the poet Theo Dorgan. Would have been one of my English tutors in college, because what happened is on a commerce degree, the first year is actually more or less arts. So it was things like English, economic history, various things like that. And Theo was my English tutor, and he was very important in helping me to improve my writing skills, which were there but needed to be very much honed. And he would have done that. And then the year that I would have done in the old NIHE would have been a mix of newspapers and broadcasting, and would have learned a bit about doing for writing for broadcasting as well. But no, very much when I did move from, well, when I say my start in broadcasting wasn't actually at Today FM. I had spent a year, which nobody ever saw, as a TV presenter in RTE.
Oh.
And back in, this really makes me feel old now, but 1991, 1992, I co-presented with Vincent Wall the business show Marketplace on RT2. I took over from Brian Dobson when Brian was moved to present the 6-1 News. He was co-presenting with Vincent. I was working in the Business Post, and I got the call, would I come and do a screen test as a possible presenter? And I went and did the screen test, and I was given the position. I was a part-time position where I went in and did it every Thursday afternoon for broadcast that night. And funny enough, at the time, it didn't, after the end of the year, they moved the programme to RT1. And then they suddenly decided, because it was moving to RT1, and we were told that we didn't have enough weight and experience to present the programme, even though the numbers had gone way up. And they brought in this little-known BBC presenter some woman called Miriam O'Callaghan, to actually present the programme. It was her first programme on RT, which I like slagging her about still, that she cost me my career in RT. But at the time, I didn't really have an interest in going into broadcasting. And I moved from the Business Post to become business editor of the Irish Independent. And RT did come to me. Joe Mulholland came and offered me the business editor's job in RT, and I wasn't interested in it. I said, no thanks, I'm happy where I am in the Independent. And that's got me the job then as the editor of the Tribune. So I was absolutely thrilled to have had that full-time career in newspapers. But then when the opportunity came up to broadcasting, I thought I have to try it. But the first couple of years were really, really difficult. The numbers bombed. Numbers went way down, and I was in trouble. And it took a lot of effort and a lot of soul searching and a lot of things, how to change how I did things. And there was a mentor who has sort of always asked me to sort of, no, don't give credit. Just this was done very quietly in the background, but a person who helped me out enormously. And she went through my whole technique as to how I presented and what I needed to do. And she basically saved my broadcasting career.
Wow. And what do you put the fact that in the early days that it didn't go so well, was that down to just the audience getting used to a different host, or was it the format, or
yeah, I think it might have been a little bit of the audience having to get used to a different host, but I think actually what happened was I was, of all things, probably over preparing. So I was actually probably too heavily scripted. And you may notice, even inside in the studio when you're in with me, that I may have bits of paper thrown around in front of me, that I don't read from a script and I don't read from a prepared list of questions. I might have a few bullet points and things down, whatever, but I tend to, in interviewing, what I try and do is I have two approaches to it that I try and do simultaneously. One is to ask the questions that I do have in my mind about the things that need to be dealt with, but I also try and listen to what the interviewee, the guest, is saying and picking up on what they're saying. And that would have been actually something that Ivan Yates would have noticed very much when we were doing the TV programme together, when we did The Tonight Show for 3 and a bit years on Virgin Media together. And I think the production team were a little bit taken aback, but I think they expected me to be the sort of the SWAT who would have everything prepared, and Ivan to be the man with sort of all the off-the-cuff sort of observations and wind-ups and the rest of it. Whereas in fact, it's actually the other way around, in that Ivan would be very much have read everything, have prepared all of the questions, but also all of the big statements he's going to make. It's almost pre-cooked. Whereas I would have been very much just listening to what the people are saying and then coming in. But I mightn't have actually read as much of the material as he would have read. And that sort of dynamic actually worked. So I suppose it's my natural inquisitiveness in trying to find out about things. So that would have been, but in the early days, I was probably scripting myself a little bit too much and it was a bit too stilted. So over time, hopefully it became just more a natural conversational flow to the program. But that said, over the 21 years in the last word, the program has continuously evolved. It's continuously changed. We've experimented with the number of items on the program, the type of items, the length of time that we give to them. And over the years, sort of new things have come in recent years, such as, for example, every Wednesday we do a thing called Culture Club, where we have a guest talking about their favorite music and books and movies. It can be really, really enjoyable. And it's a brilliant way of finding out about people. And when you ask them and the stories behind why certain gigs mean so much to them or certain books, it can be very revealing about people. So we're always looking to introduce new elements to the program and to keep a combination of keeping it fresh, but also that people know when they go to it, there's certain things that they can expect, such as maybe Marion McKeown and Cal Thomas talking about America every Tuesday. These are the type of things that they know will be there, sport on a Friday between 6 and 7.
Yeah, and you're very good at managing opposing views. I think that's one of the things that makes The Last Word particularly enjoyable. And actually, even when I think about you mentioned Ivan and I suppose your chemistry there is quite good, because I was listening to the recent Path to Power podcast where you had very opposing views in terms of you saw initially Leo Varadkar's decision to step down as selfless, and he took the opposing position that he may have seen it as quite as selfish. And actually that ability to disagree and challenge each other, I think, is something that's very healthy and very, I suppose, enjoyable for listeners to be able to.
I'm going to have words with him again, though. I listen back and he's talking over me far too often. As I'm trying to get the questions out, he's talking over me. So I know he was excited, but I'm going to have words with him.
I want to talk a little bit about, you've authored several books. So I'd love to understand a little bit about your process, and A, how do you find the time? B, what's your process?
I've done 6 books so far. With 6, when I say it, including in that, I was the ghost author but credited on Jamie Heaslip's autobiography, which was actually really, really enjoyable to do, because I was wondering about the time commitment involved in that one, and it was explained to me by another sports ghostwriter how to do it, about a certain amount of time be spent, get the interviews transcribed and work off those. So I had great fun. Jamie came round and he'd used to come round on a Saturday morning to my house and he'd sit in and we would do 2-hour sessions and talk through all sorts of stuff. And then I tried to put the book together in his voice, which was, for me, the most important thing was that it couldn't read like Matt Cooper writing it. It had to read like Jamie Heaslip. And although, he didn't have any, sometimes a lot of these sports autobiographies have these incredible stories of woe in private life and whatever. He didn't have anything like that. It was the story of a professional life, a professional career. But I very much enjoyed doing that, and I might get back to doing that type of stuff again in the future. I've done 2 biographies, one of Tony O'Reilly, who I had worked for in The Independent and in the Tribune, and one of Michael O'Leary, the Ryanair boss. The Tony O'Reilly book would probably be my favourite of all the books that I've done. I think I probably did the best job of that in the amount of information that I was able to come together. And also it was probably the best written of the books. That would be mine. And people still talk to me about it, which is always reassuring that people come and say to me about that. Now, he's of a generation where he means nothing to a lot of people, but his story is absolutely incredible. From the whole way through his sporting career as sort of the Brian O'Driscoll of rugby of his day, going into being the boss of Heinz in the US and all his interests in Ireland. And then, of course, having been a billionaire who went bust. Epic story of a fascinating man. And that he almost created a problem for me, in that it's very, very difficult to find people with as good a story to actually tell. So that's created its own issues. And then there's been 3 other books which have a different style of books, which are probably a little bit harder to write. The first one was Who Really Runs Ireland, which was back in 2009, which was effectively a sort of like a whole series of autobiographies of the people who brought us to the crash, and how they all interlinked, and how they actually had driven the Irish economy. And again, I think I did a good job with that one. Less so with the next one, How Ireland Really Went Bust. I would go back and rewrite that again significantly if I got the chance. And then the most recent one was Who Really Owns Ireland, which became a bigger project than I actually expected it to become, which I think is packed with information, hopefully in an accessible way. But one of the problems of something like that is that even since I wrote the book and finished writing it less than a year ago for publication in September, October, how much has changed? How many of the things that I was writing about have moved on, and properties and businesses haven't been sold on? But I'm still, I feel that hopefully that it was a readable and accessible book. And that gets back to the point that I was making about one of the reasons why I did go into business journalism, was that I felt I could do it in a way that would make it accessible to anybody, that anybody picking up the book would find it easy to read. That's always where that's always been important to me, that it's everything that is clear and accessible.
And how do you approach something like that? Do you set a timeline? If you take, say, for example, the most recent book, do you put a timeline on it and work back, or is it? Do you have a certain amount of time for research and writing?
Without saying what it's about, I mean, I'm now on another book project which has come out of the blue, and I was approached about it, and I went, actually, that's a great idea. And the idea has evolved, and the book is for publication in September next year. But for a September next year means that I actually have to have the book essentially written by the 1st of March next year. Okay. So I have a year to do it. Now, there's a good bit of work already gone into it over the last few months. I'm in the research stage at the moment. When I leave you today, I'm going off to do an interview with somebody to find a more background that I need from a particular time, which isn't as accessible. I have the list of interviewees. Like, I have probably about 40 interviewees identified for this book. But that, for me now, is great fun. I will love doing that. And I love setting aside a few hours each day on top of what I'm doing, my normal stuff. I will find that great fun to do.
Fantastic. The question that I have to ask you, and I know you've said to me that this often comes up, but part of my background was in martial arts. So I competed at Taekwondo for Ireland internationally for a number of years. And Taekwondo is a sport that comes from Korea.
I know actually a little bit about it, because my best friend in secondary school, who's godfather to one of my children, was actually a national champion in Taekwondo back in the 1980s.
Very good. Who's that?
Pat Field is his name, from Cork.
But
he'd be older than you now.
Yeah, Cork was a stronghold. It was one. Dublin and Cork were the obviously the two of the main areas for martial arts.
Pat Field, Holly Fitzgerald, various other people.
Very good. But yeah, so the connection to Korea is there. So you're one of the few people that's been in the hermit state in North Korea, and you ended up there with Dennis Rodman, of all people.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
Sure, why not?
How on earth did you end up in North Korea with Dennis Rodman?
I actually call this sort of my mid-journalistic life crisis, because it was a really stupid thing to have done. And no, I've sort of dined out on it quite a bit when I came, but it was January 2014 when we went, and I ended up, Aileen and myself got invited to loads of dinner parties where people wanted to hear him, and she got completely fed up listening to the same stories, been told again and again. She go, "Oh Jesus, not again." Anyway, what happened was Rodman had been out in North Korea and got a fair bit of publicity for doing so. He went out with Vice magazine in 2013, and Paddy Power Bookmakers decided that they saw an opportunity to leverage off this and to send him back in again, and it was a guy called Ken Robertson in Paddy Power. He was Head of Mischief was his title in there.
I remember him.
And Ken, brilliant ideas. And he's got an agency now, I think it's called The 10th Man. But anyway, Ken came up with this idea and persuaded his bosses, who included at the time Paddy Kennedy, the chief executive of Paddy Power. And as it happens, they made this announcement in New York with Dennis Rodman on a Thursday, I think it was, that they were going to set up this peace game in North Korea. This was in September, I think late September, early October. And as it happened, Paddy had a young fella playing on the same football team as one of my young fellas. So I would sometimes run into him on the side of the pitch and we'd be chatting while we're watching the young fellas playing football. And I asked him, I said, well, what's this about? And he starts laughing and he tells me, we're going to do this like basketball diplomacy, like the ping pong diplomacy of Richard Nixon's time. And I remember I went off to get coffees in between games. And I was walking back and I thought, geez, that'd make a great documentary. That'd be tremendous fun now to get on it. So I came back to him and I said, Paddy, by the way, are you doing anything? When he said, well, I think we have a UK company hired to do a documentary, but I'll put you in touch with them. And he goes, and I'll put you in touch with Ken. So a few days later, I'm up in Paddy Power headquarters in Belfield, and we're discussing it. And I have a business partner as well for things like the podcast I do, and we've made loads of documentaries together for Kieran O'Hara and myself. And Kieran and myself went up, and we had the conversation. We're cracking up laughing, listening to the idea they had this mad scheme. And Kieran said to me, that's a book in that, you should do a book in it. But what we did was we went over to London. We also arranged for the last word, and Kieran came over with me, and we recorded a big interview with Rodman. Now, when we recorded, I mean, like, we had to edit it extensively because he doesn't necessarily follow an articulate flow of thought. But we got on, and I met with the English company who were doing, so we said, can we come along too? And they said, yeah, of course, you can come along. So we managed to inveigle our way on. It then led to issues in relation to getting visas and stuff. But again, we managed eventually, Paddy Power managed to get us on the basis that they said they would withdraw their sponsorship if they couldn't get people in. But then, of course, about a matter of weeks before we were due to go, Kim Jong-un whacked his uncle, who was his protector, who was frog-marched out of Parliament and apparently afterwards executed.
Yeah, never seen again.
No. And then Paddy Power dropped out of it. But we said, well, look, everything is sorted out. The visas are there. The flights are booked. The accommodation, we'll just go. And I don't think Aileen thought I was being entirely serious about it, because Aileen would say that there's lots of times when I have these big ideas which I don't necessarily deliver upon. But early 2014, we went, and it caused quite a stir. I mean, it was quite funny, actually, because it caused a lot of attention back here, because when we were in Beijing preparing to fly out, there was this enormous press scrum following Rodman. But I was actually on Rodman's shoulder the whole way through the airport. And the reason I was on his shoulder was for the documentary, because if I would, the idea then was I would do the voiceover in the documentary. So they wanted me in the shot so that I could actually do the voiceover thing with him. And apparently it was on Sky News. Joe Duffy was watching Sky News that morning. And the next thing he goes, hang on a second, who's that with Rodman? And he put out a tweet, is that Matt Cooper with Rodman? And then suddenly, yeah, it is. And then there was all sorts of consternation. What the hell is going on here? Which was great for the publicity for the trip. So we went and we had a bizarre 4 days and 4 nights in Pyongyang, including the basketball game. And we managed to get all of the footage out of the country as well. And the bizarre thing about this is that every night the North Korean authorities were going in and editing the footage that had been taken during the day.
So that was part of the deal. They had to have access to it.
Except it all went into the recycle bin, and they never emptied that. And when we got out of Pyongyang, the lads literally just uploaded everything that had been cut, and we had every second of footage from our time over in North Korea, from what we've been allowed to see, because we were closely monitored. I mean, from the moment I left my hotel room, I was literally at a shadow. I had a chaperone beside me the whole way to make sure that we wouldn't go. So, or even if myself and Kieran were talking about what stuff with Colin or the other people, we might be sitting like we are here, but only about 6 feet away. The Koreans were sitting there listening to the whole thing and making sure we weren't doing anything seditious or out of the way.
And what was the most surprising thing about getting access. And of course, it's very stage managed, and you're only seeing what they want you to see. You're not seeing the poverty and the.
Well, no, I'll give you a
blackouts
perfect example of that. The day after the basketball game, now the basketball arena was a pretty impressive arena. It would have been, it would have been better than anything we'd have in Ireland. They pumped their money into small things, but I mean, you would have, for example, they only have street lights on one side of the street. They can't afford to have them on the other. And when we were driving to the airport on the way back the morning we were departing, we suddenly realised that all of the apartment blocks were pitch black, and people were coming out on their bicycles to go to work at 6:30 in the morning, but there was no light, and they just literally had no lights. So there was an awful lot of poverty and stuff like that. But they brought us to a specially created leisure centre with swimming pool and gyms and stuff like that, and massively overheated in the cold. I remember we did our filming and stuff like that, the kids. And one of the lads left something behind, a piece of equipment behind after we'd been put back in the bus. And he ran back in with one of the lads who we'd actually become friendly with. Some of the Koreans were very nice fellas. And the whole place was gone, deserted. And then he looked, and at the far side of the building, all the kids were being bussed out. It had just literally been stage managed for the whole thing for us.
It's incredible, isn't it?
So we went to I ended up, bizarrely, 10-pin bowling against the North Korean sports minister. There was just stupid, weird things that happened on the trip when we were out there, but we were quite happy to get out, because we did feel a little bit when we arrived in North Korea, and normally passport control, they actually took our passports and they didn't give them back to us. And I went, okay. And then some of the American players decided the night before the game they didn't want to play the game, and we had to call them aside and quietly say, lads, you have to play the game. No, we don't want to play the game. We're being used for propaganda purposes. We said, well, did you not know that before you came here? But look, even leaving that aside, how are you going to get home? I'm going to go to the airport and get a flight. Really? How are you going to get to the airport? You tell me now how you're going to actually get to the airport. And if you get to the airport, what flight are you going to board? There are no flights back to the United States. I mean, we are here, guests of the nation, and
completely vulnerable.
Absolutely vulnerable. And then for something that's in the documentary as well, Rodman put me in an incredibly vulnerable position as well, which I won't get into now. But I did think that I was facing the possibility of being locked up because of a stupid thing that Rodman did when he was completely drunk. So safe to say, I was quite amused after we did the documentary and I did the voiceover and the rest of it. Rodman's people blocked me on social media, which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, there you go.
That's when you know you've made it, isn't it? I want to talk to you a little bit about podcasting, because I'm thinking about your career and starting with print media and always keeping the hand in with print media, but the evolution of print to your broadcasting and to how people are consuming current affairs and consuming content now. You've obviously embraced that with the podcasting thing. So I'd love to just hear your view on how the consumption of media and news and current affairs has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I've loved all forms of media because I would have spent quite a bit of time in television, for example, as well. I did 6 years presenting Gaelic Games on what was then TV3 before it became Virgin Media. I did 2 Rugby World Cups as the lead anchor in studio, 2007 and 2015. Absolutely loved. And going back to originally, I'd wanted to be a sports journalist. So to get the opportunity to be the in-studio anchor was great fun to do. That definitely, I scratched an itch when I did those. And then I had my time doing the Tonight Show with Ivan as well. And, had wanted to see how I could do going back to doing current affairs and whatever. Now, that said, I did overload on the work level with that because what happens with television to an extent is that very high adrenaline surge. And doing that, firstly, the first couple of years was 11 o'clock at night. Then they moved us to 10 o'clock at night. But that late night finish and getting home at about midnight and still being wide awake until 1:30, 2 in the morning. And then waking again at 7:30 because even though I was trying to sleep in the morning, kids are going to school, you hear them around the kitchen, banging the front doors, going out and the rest of it. You're awake, and I wasn't getting enough sleep, and it did affect my health. So I'm glad that I gave up the TV from that regard. I didn't have a need to be on television like some people have a need to be on television, but I do like doing new things. So I love podcasting as a different way of doing radio. It's not the same as radio. I mean, there really is a difference. In radio, for example, on The Last Word, which is still my priority, but You have certain time blocks to meet. You have ad breaks to put in it on 4 occasions in the hour. You've got your news and sport that have to be on the top of the hour. There's a format to it. And there's only so far you can go in interviews with people. I think the longest might be a half an hour, even if it was the teacher or whatever. And there's usually an ad break in the middle of that or whatever. So what podcasting is given, like 2 podcasts that I'm involved in. The first one is Magnified, which is a bit like what you're doing with me now, except I do them at the kitchen table at home. So I bring people in, put a cup of coffee in front of them and get them to talk. And I love the opportunity to tease out things with interesting people. So that's great fun. But then last year I was at home sick in bed with pneumonia, which I developed out of COVID. I've had 4 blasts of COVID. Despite getting vaccinated and the rest of it, but I seem to be vulnerable to it. I don't know whether it's because I'm asthmatic or whatever, but I developed pneumonia on the summer bout of it last year, and I was lying in bed, and as I like to joke to Ivan, I was clearly delirious when I texted him and suggested this idea to him. And in fairness to him, he jumped at it. He said, that sounds like a great idea. And somebody else, a couple of people had offered him podcast ideas and he didn't go for them, but he really liked the idea of this one. And it took us a little bit of time to get it going while we were looking for sponsors and whatever. And we were working with Noel Kelly Management, who we still are in relation to it. But we came up with the concept. And look, to be honest, I mean, it's not 100 miles distant from what Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart do in the UK, and the rest is politics. So, it's something similar for Ireland. There's very few entirely new inventions when it comes to media, but it gives us the opportunity, 45, 50 minutes every Friday morning, to sit down and chew things out in hopefully an entertaining as well as informative way.
And accessible, going back to your early...
Absolutely, accessible, so that, and I'm getting, it's tremendous, great reaction. I was actually in supermarket queue in Colonel's Court last Sunday, and the next thing a guy at the queue beside just pops out his earbuds and says to me, I'm just listening to you here. Love the podcast. And it's great when you get people saying things like that. Later on, I was picking up a Chinese, and the guy behind in the bar in the Chinese restaurant, so a young fella in his early 20s, says, love the podcast, started chatting to me about it. So, and there's a whole range of people at different ages as well. And my eldest daughter is even saying it's getting her more interested in politics. She's enjoying the fact that, the sort of like the engaging way that we're discussing, hopefully the big issues and the personalities involved in it as well. So it's been great fun to do. And I suppose I'm also getting to a stage in life as well where the stuff that I'm doing it because I really want to do it. So, okay, I'm busy because I love doing the radio show, still doing that. I really enjoy doing my newspaper columns for the Business Post and for the Irish Daily Mail. And I really enjoy working with the editors. Danny McConnell in the Business Post, Conor O'Donnell in the Irish Daily Mail are super newspaper people. So I love the conversations I have with them every week about what the content and what goes in. And then the podcast is something that's sort of like a little bit of, I wouldn't say a hobby, but I'm doing it because I really enjoy it. And then the books they're an intellectual challenge to a certain extent. And putting a book together is almost like assembling a jigsaw. So it's getting all the pieces and making sure all the pieces are there, and then putting them in the right order to create the big picture that you want. But there's great satisfaction and enjoyment out of that. But at the same time, I took up golf late in 2020, and that has been the most enjoyable thing in recent years. I wish I'd taken that up years earlier.
Very good. Matt, thank you so much. It's been great catching up. Great having you on the other side of the mic. If people want to find the podcast, it's Path to Power.
Path to Power. And you get it on Apple or Spotify, or as I've been discovering, and you've probably been discovering with this as well, a lot of people are getting their podcasts through YouTube. So there's plenty of opportunities to get to it.
Super. So if you'd like to find more about that, you can find Path to Power on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow us on YouTube, on Instagram. It's @talentmatters_podcast. And again, the podcast is with thanks to our sponsors, Sanderson, the leaders in global talent solutions, and Finero, the multi-award-winning tax experts who support financial success for contractors, freelancers, and solopreneurs.